Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Touro Graduate School of Jewish Studies, a leading academic program in Jewish studies that equips students with the tools to search out their own unique path into the study of Jewish history and scholarship. Based in Midtown Manhattan, the Touro Graduate School of Jewish Studies provides students a supportive environment and personal attention from world-class faculty, seminar-style courses, one-on-one mentorship opportunities, and career advancement guidance. Students can study in person or complete their program online from anywhere in the world. The Touro University Graduate School of Jewish Studies offers a Master of Arts degree in Jewish Studies with concentrations in Jewish history and Jewish education, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Jewish history, literature, and thought. The Master of Arts program includes in-person, remote, and hybrid options. Each program consists of a rigorous, well-structured curriculum in which students are able to discuss and debate ideas and delve into challenging texts with professors and with passionate, accomplished peers. Study with world-renowned scholars at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies, including Dean Michael Schmidman and Professor Schneur Lyman, Judith Bleich, Jeffrey Wolf, Susan Weissman, and Donna Fishkin, among other respected experts. For more information on admission to the Touro Graduate School of Jewish Studies, including scholarship opportunities, please visit gsjs.touro.edu. That's gsjs.touro.edu, or call 212-463-0400 extension 55580. To sponsor an episode or support the podcast, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or see the links and information in the show's notes below. You can also find a link in the show's notes below to join the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and so on. And also, you can, if you can, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, whether you listen on 24/6, which just added gapless audio, by the way, Spotify or Apple, or whatever it is that you listen. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Federica Francesconi, and we'll be discussing her new book called Invisible Enlighteners, The Jewish Merchants of Modena, From the Renaissance to the Emancipation, which is published by Penn University Press. So thank you, Professor Francesconi, for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. And I'm looking forward to have this exchange of questions and answers, because you are perhaps more expert than I am on some aspect of Italian Jewish history. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. And thank you again.
Okay, thank you for the praise. I don't know about that, but we'll see. So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I studied in Italy for my BA and MA, and in classics, history, and art history. I was studying at the University of Bologna, that is the most ancient university in the world, and then I got intrigued by Judaica collections that I was working on for my master dissertation, and from there I tell you the truth. Actually, I went to a conference in Toledo, organized by the European Association for Jewish Studies, and I presented one of my findings on the Judaica collection, actually the Judaica collection on Modena, on Atarote Rimonim, and that is the patrimony. I also talk about it in the book. Is extraordinary, from the 18th century, perfectly preserved collection that basically is now in the synagogue of Modena, that was built as an emancipation temple in 1872 and 1873, and all the small synagogues basically were organized there, and also their patrimonies. In any case, I was working in museums. I gave this paper. In the audience, there were two professors of Jewish history, Roberto Bonfil and Kenneth Stowe. They start asking me questions if I would have been interested in pursuing my studies more, but in a historical line. And for me, studying in Israel was always a dream, and I thought I embrace it. So my PhD is from the University of Haifa, and then in Jewish history, and then in early modern Jewish history. I focus also on Jews in Modena. And then the last year of my PhD program, I got a scholarship as a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and I had the opportunity to work with David Ruderman and other scholars. Was an extraordinary year about the history of the Jewish and the Hebrew book, and I fell in love with the American academia. I went back to Israel for a while, and then I really realized that I really like the American academia and being an academic, and here I am. Now I'm an associate professor at University of Albany, and I am a director of the Judaic Studies program.
Okay, very interesting. So how specifically did you get to the Jews of Modena to write a book on them, and who is these, why do you call them, who are they, invisible, as you call them, invisible enlighteners?
So what happens is that is connected also, by the way, to your first question. So how I was intrigued by Italian Jewish history, and specifically on Jews in Modena. While I was researching this collection of Judaica, I found in a library in Modena a complete family archive of the Formigenes family. And the Formigenes are one of the main families of merchants I analyzed in my book, and nobody ever touched. This archive was connected to a famous editor, Angelo Fortunato Formigine, who committed suicide in 1938 in the aftermath of the promulgation of the racial laws against Jews in Italy. His widow donated the collection of his documents to the University Library in Modena, including the family archives that start from 1638 and they go through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So that was for me a big thing. And then from there, I started finding sources and discovering this community that nobody studied. And I concentrated in particular on the Jewish merchants, because the mercantile elite was becoming more visible through the sources. Why invisible enlighteners? So they were becoming visible through the sources. And as a matter of fact, even if ghettoized since the 1638, Jews in Modena were never mentioned in the public discourse of the Este, the ruling family, but their buildings were everywhere, and their role as cultural intermediaries was quite prominent in the history of the city. And for those who don't think that Italy is the center of the world, and Modena as well. So Modena was a capital city of an independent state in the Italian peninsula in the north. And after 1598, when the more famous city, Ferrara, was incorporated in the Papal State, the city of Modena became the capital of this independent state that was Italian and in a little bit also under the influence of the empire for 2 centuries.
Right. So to tell people where Modena is, I'm looking at a map. It's kind of like in between Florence to the south, Milan, and Venice. Exactly. It's like right in the middle.
Exactly. If you go from Florence to Milan, you will see Bologna and Modena, and you can stop there for any kind of good food and good history also.
So maybe let's talk a little bit more just about Modena before we get into the, for the listeners. So Italy at that time, there was city-states, there was the papal states. Explain a little bit what was going on in Italy at that time, because there was no Kingdom of Italy till much later. So what was going on in Italy at this time? And you also mentioned they went from Ferrara to Modena. What happened there? You talk about this in the book a little bit. So give a little bit of just an overview of the general, what was going on in Italy, as we call it, even though there was no country Italy then, and what was, especially as it pertains to Modena.
And you're absolutely right in emphasizing the fact that it was not an Italian country, an Italian nation. But what was interesting there is there was an Italian culture that was shared by Christians and Jews alike. So as we're talking about with the start of my book, 1598, when there is this change and Modena becomes the capital of the state. And I go through 1797 with the arrival of Napoleon, when Modena is incorporated in the Cisalpine Republic and then the Kingdom of Italy under Napoleon. So what was the structure there? Different independent states that had a sort of autonomous life, except for the religious aspect. The religious sphere was basically determined by the papal state. So that is also what properly you mentioned, the Inquisition, that was a central organization appointed to basically put under surveillance and stop heresy in all the Italian Catholic states, and at times included also Jews. It's not, sometimes there is this idea that the Inquisition was persecuting Jews. Actually, the Inquisition was appointed as a magistracy to basically control Christians. And then there were Spain with a lot of differences. Sometimes new Christians, of course, the so-called new Christians, were under the Inquisition because they were suspected, under the scrutiny of the Inquisition, because they were suspected to Judaizing in secrecy, or there were some crimes that could be connected by Jews that were under the scrutiny of the Inquisition. For example, a blasphemy against Christianity, or going against common beliefs between Jews and Christians, such as the immortality of the soul, or owning prohibited books. So this is why, in a way, there are these independent states, but the Inquisition, paradoxically, is the only Italian institution that is centralized and has different branches. And that is important for my context also, because when Modena became in 1598, the capital city of the state was also, the Inquisition there was reinforced, and the Inquisition, the Italian Inquisition per se, in 1540, 1542, was renovated and reinforced on all the Italian territories. In terms of what we can see also Italy and Modena, and as you properly mentioned, at the center of Northern Italy, was also, if we look at Jewish history in general. What was happening? We had by the late 15th century, after the expulsion of Jews from England, France, Germany, Spain, and then Portugal with these forced conversions, Italy, northern and central Italy, became a sort of safe ports for Jews, and this also remained after the expulsion from the kingdoms of Sicily, 1492, 1493, and the expulsion from Naples in 1510. So here we have basically Western Europe was empty of Jews except for Italy. So what we have here, if we follow in a way the history of Jews in Modena, we have also a mirror of the history of other communities in terms of settlements. The Este, the ruling family, was more welcoming, not because they liked particularly Jews, but because they are interested in commercial networks. They were, and also in competing with the Catholic Church in their state. The Este were always more prone to welcome Jews than other independent states. That doesn't mean they were not ghettoized, because Jews were ghettoized in 1638. And also there was, in any case, an overall change in the aftermath of the Reformation of the condition of Jews. 1516, the Jews in Venice was created. Then in 1555, the Pope Paul IV promulgated the Bull, this important document, the Cum Nibis Absurdum, accusing Jews of being arrogant in living and exchanging too much with Christians. Jews were ghettoized in Rome. Their professions were reduced to second-hand selling and many lending activities. And then this ball basically led through the creation of ghettos in Italy. And in Modena, the ghettoization was a process of basically transvesting the community as a Catholic state that has to contain Jewish pollution, because as we know, Jews were considered polluters of the Christian body of the societies in Europe. And this was an excuse also. Jews are there, are ghettoized. We don't mention the fact that they run our culture and our economy. Without them, we will be completely isolated as a state. And also, there were also different phases, such as the promulgation of index, the books, the list of prohibited books, the Talmud was banned, the Bible in the vernacular, meaning in Italian or Yiddish, for example, were banned, and Jews and Christians alike had their books scrutinized, and in Modena in particular, because this city had a long story of heterodoxy in Christianity. So there was also the story of the city. Apparently, actually, the Inquisition, the new Inquisition that was promulgated in 1540, 1542, was promulgated exactly because people were afraid of what the clergy in Rome were afraid of what was going on in cities specifically like Modena, with all of these Christian heterodox groups. Jews were too much involved, etc.
Okay, so we'll get specifically to Modena in a second. Just a general question. Why, you mentioned the Papal States, where Rome at the head, the Pope was basically a king of his own area. And then, but Jews lived there in the Papal States, and then Jews were in Florence, Venice, Ferrara, Modena, etc. And then the north of Piedmont, there were Jews all over here in other small towns and cities. Why was Italy so accepting, so to speak, allowing the Jews in when so many other countries were not? Is there a reason why they were more accepting, so to speak, to some extent?
Okay, so first of all, I would say that a lot has to do with Catholic theology, in the sense that in Catholic theology, if we think about Paul and then Augustine, the church father who shaped the Catholic Church, Jews actually should not be expelled. Jews are accused of being blind. Jews are accused of being stubborn. They don't see the truth in their own scriptures. They don't recognize Jesus. They also ask Jesus Christ, exactly, as a prophet and the Messiah, etc. And also they kill Jesus. So all of these elements were there and were shaped by the church fathers. What happened, though, with Augustine is that, and here I'm looking at Jeremy Cohen's studies, etc., are excellent, and we all look at him for this theorization, but actually that is what happened. So that with Italy, and you're absolutely right in outlining why Italy, that were really at the core of the Catholic Church, because for the Catholic Church, Jews deserve to be scattered, deserve to be second-class citizens, but they should not be killed. And if with their presence in Christianity, they basically show the truth of the church. So look, we as Christians we are right. Look, Jews didn't recognize Jesus, and now they are scattered and persecuted. At the same time, though, there is the recognition that first, Jews will bring, with their scriptures, they didn't recognize the truth in, but they are studying their scriptures, are important within Christianity. Because who is studying Hebrew? Who is studying the Hebrew Jews? And consequently, also, they should not be prohibited to keep their customs. And lastly, there is also this hope, that is in a way announced by Paul in the letter to the Romans, that Jews at a certain point will recognize the new covenant. So there is this hope for conversion that then by the way, in millennialist attitude, will bring the second coming of Jesus. So legally speaking, for the Catholic theology, Jews cannot permanently expelled. That doesn't mean that there were a lot of, in the 16th and starting the second half of the 16th century in particular, a lot of local expulsion. So you mentioned Rome. At a certain point, the Papal State basically gathered Jews in four main cities, Rome, Ancona, Bologna, and then Ferrara in 1598. And of course, then there are different attitudes. You see, for example, in Rome, particularly with Paul IV, this intent of conversion. So there were messianic expectations in Rome that animated Paul IV. So his idea was ghettoizing Jews, reducing them to poverty, and then to push them toward conversion. While if we look at Modena, was more a sort of escamotage in order to keep Jews in the fabric of the city. There was never this rhetoric against Jews compared to filthy dogs that we can see in Rome, Frankfurt, or Barcelona. But definitely, these are the reasons. Catholic theology is the reason why we see Jews in Rome at this time and not in Barcelona or Madrid.
Right. By the way, I'm Paul IV, the evil Pope. I did a podcast interview a while back with Martina Mampieri about her book that talks about him and what what he did to the Jews. So anyone can go find that old episode. Okay, so let's focus on Modena. You focus on Modena, where you said where the Jews were allowed under the Essay, they were allowed there. So what was particular? I mean, you mentioned this a little bit before, but what was particularly unique and about the Jews of Modena, especially like you said, the mercantile elite? And you start off before the ghetto, but we can get there. We can discuss their ghettoization and the Inquisition and all of that. So discuss, I guess all that in general and whatever specifics you want to talk about.
So what I would say is that if you look at some stories I tell in my book, there is this Jews of Modena, this librarian this banker and merchant who became also a collector of books. And at the beginning, between the end of 16th and the 17th century, and he emerged with the mercantile elite. And by the way, another interesting aspect about Jews in Modena is that Jews like Jews of Modena were first bankers, then became merchants. There is not a change in the elite. The same families are transforming themselves. So this is one aspect. Another aspect is that, and that is quite extraordinary, is that Jews in Modena had the possibility to enroll themselves in all the guilds of the city. And that, of course, brought a lot of possibilities, not only for Jewish merchants, but also for Jewish small entrepreneurs or peddlers as well. This is one aspect in terms of economy. But if we look at the history of the city, and by the way, Jews in Modena were always around the 5-6% of the total of the population, from 800 in 1638 when the ghetto was established, through 1200 or 1300 at the end of the 18th century, and then the mid of the 19th century as well. What we have here in terms of also, if we look at this Jews of Modena, it was not an author, it was not a published intellectual, but he was a cultured man. And what we see there in this collection of books that perhaps we'll go back to, but is the idea of being in dialogue and producing also a Renaissance culture that was particular about not only rabbis who were important in Modena, but also was shared by merchants like Jews of Modena or women who were involved because of their families in this mercantile elite, and they were studying the Talmud, like Fioretta Modena, Aaron Berechia's grandmother. And we'll go back to Aaron Berecchia Modena, the author of the Bavaria book that was published in 1626 in Mantua. And so this is for the production of Renaissance culture, a particular practice of the Enlightenment. So Jews in Modena, and again, Jewish merchants in Modena, produce a particular Ashkala, a particular Jewish enlightenment that was looking at more at the French secular and legal culture rather than German, the Prussian Ashkala that was more known, that is sometimes is more known. Or Jewish merchants also produce a particular form of female agency that was a sort of reworking with different aspects. If I think, for example, about Miriam Rovigo, who was related to one of the most important Sabbatian prophet in Italy and in the Mediterranean as well, Aaron Rovigo, who established in the same house where the Sabbatian circles were gathering her own philanthropic Jewish female confraternity. So there are different stories that can tell us different components of why these culture and this production and this society was vibrant. And also the idea of bridging. So these merchants were basically, I already mentioned the Kabbalah, the Luriani, I can add the Luriani Kabbalah, Cordoverian Kabbalah, Sabbatianism, Enlightenment culture, the encyclopedia. And so it's sort of bridging as the center, Modena and the Jewish mercantile elite with their centers and structures, Chevrot, etc., were basically bridging Europe and the Mediterranean for fostering connections and culture for many other communities around the Mediterranean and the European context.
Now, and where does the ghetto and then the Inquisition, the inaction of a ghetto and then the Inquisition come into play over here with this community?
So that is very interesting. Basically, what happened is that the inquisitors, as soon as they were appointed in this city as that became a full inquisitorial center because the city was promoted to be a capital city in 1598, they immediately understood that the keys for the community, for bringing the community under control, were Jewish merchants and Jewish bankers. So these Jews, I'm referring to these Formiginis, Sanguinettis, Modenas, Vorovigos, Carmis, Trabottis, that also were characterized by mercantile activities and at the same time also by intellectual scholars who were part of these families, became the target of the Inquisition. That was immediately since 1598. So Jews, for example, I just mentioned the question of books. And in 1596, there was the promulgation of the Index of Prohibited Books that was a list that actually affected more Christians than Jews, except for one aspect, that the Talmud at that time was completely banned. So that is also a matter of characteristic and difference if you think about other communities where the Talmud was admitted. Of course, that the Talmud was transmitted and taught through Al-Fassi, for example, and other legal codes, but that was something that really shaped Jewish culture and the surveillance of the inquisitors. Also, a series of rules or booklets were written often by converts from Judaism to Christianity who were working for the Inquisition offices, and they were appointed to scrutinize all the Hebrew books and be sure that Jews were not committing blasphemy against Christianity, accusing them of being idolaters. That was a classic thing. And here, what is also particular, though, and you mentioned the fact that Italian Jews were particular in terms of their culture, here what we see, because I digged a lot in Inquisition trials against Jews and Jewish merchants in particular, and also looking at what exactly they had in their houses, and exactly also the production of their intellectuals, such as Rabar Bra of Modena. What it comes out is also that Jews actually quite understood quite clearly what were the rules. You just cut some words that could lead the idea. So Christian inquisitors were obsessed by the idea that Jews could call them idolaters. So it's very easy to look at nimin and minim, etc., and just cut the word. But what the Jews were scrutinized also was for their owning on non-allowed or non-corrected books in Latin and Italian. So that was also part here of the culture that was different compared to other communities. And surely the Inquisition pushed for ghettoization. As a matter of fact, when in 1638 the Duke accepted to establish the ghetto that was actually announced already in 1618, then it's very interesting, because then the Inquisition in a way withdrew from this obsession about Jews, and we have the neophyte house that becomes more and more militant. What I mean by neophyte house, an organization that had as a goal the conversion of Jews to Christianity. So there is a sort of, Jews are in the ghetto, the Inquisition in a way lose interest, and the neophyte house and campaign of conversion come to the scene.
Right. Okay. So what we just covered, a lot of general, covered in the book in various chapters. So we'll go a little bit more specific soon. Different chapters. You have chapter 1, network of Jewish families in the early modern period. You have Jewish leaders. You have Jewish household family network, social controlled and gendered spaces, the invisible wealth of silver. So you have the journey of the Reformigenes, Jewish female agency. And a lot of what you mentioned is throughout the book. I do want to ask you another general question here. You mentioned a number of times bankers and merchants. What do you mean by that? Can you define what each one was, what they did, define for listeners what that meant?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. So basically, what happens often in Italy is that all the settlements that started in northern and central Italy started because a single individual city was inviting a family of many lenders to the city in order to provide a service for the poor. We are not talking about the Christian wealthy bankers from Flores. Here we are talking about small operators. And various scholars have also put in comparison the function that in these cities, like in Modena, Jews and prostitutes had. Both were not liked by the institution and by the church, but both were considered necessary for the containment of lust or for the need to provide poor with some money to the poor. So what happened here is that we have the family of Modena, or the Modenas, that is the same family that some of you perhaps are thinking about will listen to us. We have two important rabbis. One is Leone Modena from Venice, whose family was the same family from Modena, and just to complicate the situation, often Italian Jews were taking the name from the first city they settled in. So we have the Rabar Bra of Modena, or the Modena's family from Modena. And this was a family of probably Jews, I think, I'm not totally sure, but the branch that arrived in Italy, Modena, was coming from Provence, and then Viterbo, southern Italy, and then Modena. So they arrived in the 14th century and they stayed. And so they were basically, and usually what happens that there were were few settlements. These families often were coming with some collaborators, for example, a tailor or a butcher. The families, for example, in Modena, the Jewish families in Modena obtain their official cemetery in the 1470s. So there is a settlement that is quite typical about Jewish communities in Italy here in Modena. What we see here, so basically these Jews were giving, borrowing, lending money, but the interest was controlled by the institutions. And actually was a quite lower interest compared to the many lenders who were not Jewish, who were active in the city. What happened then is that usually there is, in the 16th century, a sort of change, as I mentioned already, in terms of leadership. Instead of, so the Jewish bankers leave or they disappear from the scene according to the archival evidence. Here we have the same families who transform themselves. So from being many lenders on the small scale, they keep the credit as activities for their economy, but then they enlarge. For example, the Modenans become important entrepreneurs in the production of the silk. And for example, the Jewish merchants in Modena had factories connected to the production of the silk that were very important and were giving jobs to many Christians and Gentiles in the city. The Sanguinettis arrived were Ashkenazic Jews. So the Modenans were Italian, probably Ashkenazi in origin, but they became Italian. They represented themselves as Italian Jews. The Sanguinettis are the other family that I'm studying. For example, in their synagogues, they often had also Maxurim in Yiddish. They arrived in 1565, and they were Ashkenazic Jews. And they became producers of, they were bankers at the beginning, and then producers of silver objects or silks. So this society, what is also interesting is that was not impermeable. So was a sort of elite, but open. And in fact, we see the Formigini, just to tell a story, very small entrepreneurs. They come from Ferrara in 1598 after the devolution of the city of Ferrara to the Papal State. One of their leader is immediately targeted by the Inquisition, is tortured by the Inquisition because he's accused of having attempting to convert a Christian servant to Judaism. And then these families become the most important family in the ghetto in a few decades. And for example, one of the leaders of the Jewish Enlightenment is a member of this family. So this is a little bit what is the difference here. And again, in terms of profession, what was also interesting is that Jews could enroll in guilds, and that give them them the possibility to expand their activities in the smaller and larger scale.
Can you just clarify, what do you mean by enrolling in a guild? What did a guild do?
So basically, thank you. So guilds were professional associations in corporations also. We use it as in history this term. For example, you couldn't practice the profession of selling jewels if you were not enrolled in the corporation of the city. Same for the silk, same for the printing activities, same for haberdashery, for example, or for producing and selling glass. What happened is that usually in all the European cities, Jews were excluded from the access to the corporation. While in Modena, Jews were allowed, they paid the double. So it was a sort of union, let's say. They were allowed to enroll in these corporations, paying the double amount of money, but they were allowed to have access to the corporation and to be recognized as merchants in or small entrepreneurs or peddlers also in the city, legally speaking. So this brought a lot of possibility to integrate themselves and to make a living beyond the many lending activities that by the 17th century was basically over.
So you mentioned before, we'll get back to, Huda of Modena. Well, not of Modena, I'm sorry. Huda Modena, who was Venetian Jew, but his family name was Modena. He was a cousin, like you said, of Rabar Bra, who we'll get to, the author of Mavri Yablik. Maybe listeners are familiar, or probably he's pretty famous sefer, who was from Modena. But let's just talk about that. So you mentioned Huda, but I bring him up because he said he was from Venice. So how did the community of Modena compare or differ from the Jewish communities of Venice, Padua, Mantua, other communities nearby?
So what I would say is there were some elements here connected to their ruling family and the negotiation also the Jews had with in the moment of the creation of the ghetto, and the fact they could, basically since 1622 they could enroll in the corporations. That was a big deal. That there was no other community among those that you mentioned that had this privilege. On the other side, also the fact that often in other states, Jews were allowed to live in, for example, in Venice or Padua, or Florence, but they were expelled from small centers. Here in the Este Duchy, we don't see expulsion from small centers, and rather there was a sort of, sometimes I also call the community of Modena a community of refugees, because there were also a lot of refugees on the move that arrived there, not only in the aftermath of 1492 that we see Sephardic Jews arriving in big numbers, but we see also Jews arriving from other states that are welcome. For example, in 1630, in the aftermath of the plague, Jews are expelled from Mantua and they are welcome in the Este Duchy. So this is one aspect. In terms of difference, I would also say that now, for example, I'm working on the Jewish community of Venice and the Jewish home in the 16th and 17th century. What I would say that the big difference here is that, or if we look at Livorno, where the ghetto was not established, what I would say that while in other, let's say, poor cities, such as Venice and Livorno, we have this fluid space often, and the Jewish new Christians who arrive in Venice, they return to Judaism. New Christians who arrive, they return to Judaism, then they leave or they stay for a while. Here we have, and the communities had all their distinct minhagim, they had distinct communities. Here is more arriving and staying. And instead of having all of these fragmentations of different communities, and my idea in Venice is that the boundaries were porous in the Jewish home, exactly because otherwise there were all these communities already distinct in the ghetto. What I see in Modena is that Jews arrive, they stay for centuries. Some are still there, some move to Israel. So there is a long continuity of becoming and embracing the city. And then there is a sort of very easy amalgamation of the different dot without particular frictions. So the community becomes a Jewish home. So and another thing, for example, these families, instead of having communities who run the Sephardic synagogue, the Italian synagogue, the Ashkenazic synagogue, are families who maintain the synagogues for the others. So that is, I would say, is a more arriving, staying, investing in the city without the internationalization of the mercantile routes that we can see in Venice and Livorno.
Okay, so now you have a chapter. The one chapter you talk about the books, and you mentioned this earlier with Moshe Modena, and his books and the confiscation of his books, and you go through his library, whether that's his Svarim that he owned and was reading, or his secular books. So talk about that and the confiscation and Inquisition, because it's really a fascinating glimpse into what was as you're talking about these invisible lighteners and what was going on in Modena, the Jewish community.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a story that on which I spent so much time, because also understanding all. So basically what happened is that in 1600, in February 1600, this Jewish merchant, Jews of Modena, was called by the Inquisitor in Modena various times. And he was requested to show list of his book. And, it's not that Jews didn't know what was going at the time. So he tried to hide his books. And interestingly enough, the issue was not related to Hebrew books. Then the Inquisitor wanted all the list, and we get also the list of his Hebrew books. But what was the crime in the eyes of the Inquisition was that he was owning forbidden or unexpurgated books, meaning that unexpurgated, there is this category in Latin that is done corrigantur, that means the books that should be read only after correction. And these books were classic works in Italian, Latin, and Spanish. We have, for example, a Bible in Spanish, in the vernacular, De Vanitate by Cornelia Agrippa, that is a classic against being vain in Italy. But the fact that this author, who was really a member of the Counter-Reformation, was talking too much about how to avoid to be vain. The book was dangerous because there was a lot of notions about being vain. And then a book on magic by Raymond Lull, the Decameron by Boccaccio, and a dictionary from Latin to Greek written by two Protestant authors. So these were the books that the Inquisitor found. Jews of Modena goes back and forth. There are various letters, and sometimes there is this assumption in looking at list of books that they tell you the truth. No, actually, this list never tell you the truth, in my opinion, except in this case. Because in this case, the merchant, one of my protagonists, is really obliged to bring everything. Otherwise, often, for example, what happened in Modena only a few years earlier is that why Jews were, sometimes we think, Jews were in Italy, were speaking in Italian, but were reading in Hebrew based on this list. Because Jews knew what was going on. So why showing that in your list you have Boccaccio that is prohibited, where you can just put a book of Midrash and nobody will care about it? So that was one thing that for me was important in terms of methodological turn to look at the context of this list and who was going to this library. All of these writers, he's the son of Moisés Aaron Berechiah, so there are a lot of books on Kabbalah, obviously, because his son, in a case, even if they were fighting all the time, that is not that unusual among Jews, but is also the fact that he was using the library of his father. So what I found there is a sort of impressive library that range from Renaissance culture, Petrarch, Marsilio Ficino, and the classic of Hebrew culture, Rashi, Midrashim, the Sefer HaKutzari, Meorei Naim. So basically legal codes, Hebrew grammar, medical codes, Kabbalistic literature, I already mentioned, and then also books in Italian and Latin, rhetoric, medicine, and philosophy. So what you see here is that while outstanding scholars who concentrate on intellectual and cultural history, such as, for example, Joanna Weinberg and David Ruderman is the champion of these studies, actually, they really discovered the culture of the intellectuals. And what I discovered that actually the culture of the intellectuals who were living in this area was exactly shared only also by Jewish men and Jewish women of the time in Modena. And that is what basically this library shows. I talk also about this library about cultural communion and cultural hybridization, because for me what was important here is in a way go over this concept of acculturation, where always we are so happy because finally Jews read a book in German or read a book in Latin or Italian. Actually, here what I show is that Leone Breo, for example, before the generation before, they were reading books in Italian and Latin, but the idea was always that the Hebrew culture emerge as more important. In my opinion, here what we see is that Jews were not feeling colonized by Italian and Latin culture. They knew exactly where we're standing, and they were using, in their eyes, Italian, Latin culture were important as much as Hebrew culture. Even, of course, the Hebrew culture had some more importance because of the structure of the studies, the curriculum, etc. But there is not the idea that I have to study and I have to read Italian in order to be cultured. I read Italian and Latin because it's important, and for me I don't feel the competition with those cultures as well.
So we mentioned him already, but Rabar Bra of Modena maybe is the most famous rabbi from the city, one who wrote the Sefer Mariabik, which was done in a new edition by Avat Shalom many years ago, just was reissued again. They also put out his drushes from manuscript. But Mariabik is a Sefer about sick and dying and burial and all that kind of thing, and a lot of Kabbalah in there. So you'll talk a little bit about him. And we mentioned Yehuda Ari of Modena, but he was he keeps saying of Modena. He wasn't of Modena. He was from Venice. So we should talk a little bit about Aaron Brachia, and then you do discuss a fair amount in your book. Also, there was a trial. I believe he was involved with confiscated books as well. So we can talk about him, and then maybe we'll talk about some other rabbinic figures of Modena.
Aaron Brachia. So I knew, of course, about the story of Aaron Brachia Modena, that he was from Modena. And because I'm a social historian, for me, what was important is to dig into the role that Aaron Brachia Modena played and sometimes attempted to play into the society. So he was a charismatic leader. And there were also moments that are quite funny. For example, he was involved in, at a certain point, one of his brother-in-law. So he had opened this Kabbalistic group, the Shomrim LaBocher. The Shomrim LaBocher was the book of prayers that he authored for a group of a confraternity, the Chevrat Makshivim, that he opened in his house in 1614. So what happened is that then this confraternity was strongly connected to the devotional group of the Meir Shachar that was also established by Aaron Brachia Modena in his house. So basically what he was doing while his father was collecting his book, he was fighting with his father. He was raised by his grandmother, Fioretta, and we'll go there immediately. But what he did, basically, he organized a sort of center it was a sort of centripetal and centrifugal center for the Kabbalah, both Lurianic and Cordoverian, even if sometimes it's divided between the two, in his house. And what he does, at a certain point, he enters into a conflict with another Kabbalistic group, the Shomrim LaBocher, the Watchers of the Money, that was established by his brother-in-law, Yosef Karmi, in 1623 in another synagogue owned by another family, the Osidio. So what happened is that basically there is a sort of war between these two leaders, and Aaron Brachia Modena accused Karmi of composing secular piyutim for the synagogue, while actually, in his opinion, only those offered by the Tenaim and the Amoraim should be allowed. So here, what is interesting, you see all these merchants and rabbis involved in this polemic, and Nathanael Drabotti, who was also an important rabbinical figure of the time, he must basically legiferate on this contrast on poetry by these two rabbis. And what he does, actually, he comes up with a theory of literature that look at the Baroque poetry in Italy, and he decides that in any case also the secular the religious poems authored by rabbis who come after the Tenaim and Amoraim are admissible in the synagogue. So what was there is interesting is that in the meantime, where Aaron Berchia was going against this piyutim, he was authoring and writing piyutim as well. So it's very interesting. What about sex, the reception of sex is really interesting. For me, what was intriguing is in terms of the role of the society, because you see already from this polemic that he was trying to emerge as the leader for the Kabbalistic thought in Italy, in northern Italy. And as a matter of fact, his house made it. It was an important center. Then in 1626, when he authored the Bavaria book, his role and the importance of the Bavaria book was predominant, particularly toward the Eastern Europe. And also, he makes attempts at regulating the society in Modena and the Jewish society in Modena. So what is interesting, he's aware of, there are cases of possession of women in contemporary Safed and Damascus. So he knows through the diaries, the journals that come from Cain Vital, etc. So he's aware of the fact there are things, or the attempts by Catholic in the city to constrain women in clusters, in convents. So there is all this mix of Jewish and non-Jewish culture and society, these attempts of pushing women in a sort of bibliotheca selecta that is also interesting in Aaron Berechia Modena, but it's not, sometimes there is always this idea of thinking, rabbis were so bad for women and they just try to isolate women. No, actually, Aaron Berechia, that is in my book, is quite sophisticated. Yes, he thinks to basically confine Jewish women in a domestic sphere. And this is not just this process, it's the process of the entire mercantile elite that in the moment of the ghettoization and tries to put under control women who could be dangerous for the balance of the society. Of note, these mercantile elite and rabbinical elite as well together, they were basically leading the society into the ghettoization and emancipation without traumas. So what happened with Aaron Berechia Modena, that while he tries to confine women in the domestic sphere, he's doing so with sophistication. So he attempts to create for women spaces that are not just the kitchen. So he composed prayers, tchinas for them, where there is a sort of, there are invocations to the matriarchs. He tries to convince women to hold a candle during childbirth instead of a Torah scroll, as women sometimes were doing, in order to have a sort of protection from the Torah. So there are all of these elements, and the creation of prayers for women, or rituals in the case of the candle, that tell us that yes, he had this idea of separated spheres, but he was building a space for women. And as we can see also, women until the 17th century had opportunities in Modena, and then change with this control of the elite. Then the domestic sphere becomes a center where women can articulate more. But for example, talking about Fioretta Modena, his grandmother, we see also how widows in Modenese Jewish society and the Italian Jewish society in general, at times, or European society, think about Glickel from Ameln, had more opportunities to realize themselves. So Fioretta Modena, after in widowhood, she left Modena and she goes to the Holy Land, as it was called, in pursuing Kabbalistic studies. And that is quite extraordinary. She was educating Aaron Berechia, and at the same time in religious subject, and at the same time in the moment which she's not anymore necessary in her domestic sphere, she leaves in order to fulfill these intellectual and devotional ambitions and aspirations.
Yeah, so like I said, you know Rabar Bra a number of times in your book, and different listeners may be familiar again from his Marva Yabik, which I'll read from the Avat Shalom introduction and his history. It says that this is a famous work, but it says here, Sefer Kol Seder Hagas Ishi Yisraeli B'Tshuva V'Maisim Tovim Kol Yimei Yoyse Ad Shuvi LaAfrei Seder Hagas Adam Mecholyev when he's sick, P'tirase when he dies, Seder Hashkava Tyra V'Akvura when they're doing Tara and burial, Seder Tfilas and all that stuff. He also has another famous work called Ashmeres HaBoiker, which was, again, reading from Avat Shalom introduction, Kol Seder HaTfilos V'Abakoshes Lechevrat Mashkimei Koim Me'irei Ashach Asher B'Moda. People that wake up early in the morning, there was different tfilos and bakoshes. He put them together, and he had a number of other works. Now, you mentioned Fioretta, his grandmother. I think it's worth reading from the introduction of Ashmeres HaBoiker. It's in, you can, any listeners interested, you can find this, again, in the New Mavriyabik edition, in the Avat Shalom introduction. It does bring this down. So he mentions her. He grew up in her house. As they wrote, for whatever reason, they talk about this. So he writes like this. He says, "Shekama piois pasa b'mechaya l'schusi lecha." She did a lot for him. V'gam shekol yameh. This is what he's talking about her whole life. Like paska puma megirsa. She didn't stop learning b'mikra, so chumash, b'mishnah and mishnayis, b'sifrei apaiskim. I don't know who he's talking about. Paiskim halacha. U'b'reish kulam harambam. She knew Rambam. Vegam, he says, and also Sach Hayala B'Sefer HaZoyer Kafi Asagasa. He spoke to her, he learned Zoyer with her. Umeakol Asasalah, she made Sidarim Mide Shavua B'Shavua. B'Reish Kol Maser said Kaisea Tamid Hoyseyadeh Psucha B'Ritzi Zav Kesef Lahamti Le'Anoshim Uganim Shalem Duni Terv Yerushalayim. He said she was made sure to pay, and she would hire tutors and people to learn with him. Valzeh Kasasam, from you write Raglea Imi Meir Al Ir. He goes on, and then sorry, I'll read the next part. Skipping, he says, she was 75. She went up and she went to Tzvas, and she went there. There's also the Yehuda Moda's autobiography talks about her, so you can see this in the introduction, again, to the Avat Shalom edition. It's really fascinating where he talks about his grandmother, who was really well-learned, and how she learned all these forms. It's a very, very interesting thing. And again, his Mavriyabik is still a classic, quoted by everybody, very important sefer. So he's one. You mentioned earlier from Rovigo, who I did a series on Shapsei Tzvi. Had Professor Matt Goldish, who has written numerous articles on and researched Rovigo and his house. But perhaps we want to talk a little bit about him and some other any other rabbinic figures in Modena.
Yeah, absolutely. What is interesting about Rovigo is that Matt Goldish wrote, and he's writing actually also a new book about Rovigo, and Sonne Benahiao, Isaiah Sonne and Meir Benahiao also published some documents that were basically part of his of his writing, of this library, not to mention Gershom Scholem, etc. So here, what is for me interesting? So we're talking about a moderate Sabbatian figure who in Modena created a center for a moderate Sabbatian followers, even after continuing to following Tzvi, also Shabbatai Tzvi, also after his conversion to Islam, etc. So what is interesting for me there is that you see, first of all, the intervention of attempts at making the Jewish space of Modena a sort of redemption space. There is a river, there are connections between the Yabok and this river at the Panaro in Modena. There are moments in which, for example, for the Tisha B'Av, that becomes a sort of joyous moment where Modena and Jerusalem seem the same city. So there are all of these aspects that for me were intriguing, looking at the ghetto as a space. But even more, for me, was interesting to see what was happening in their house. And even after the death of Rovigo. By the way, very interesting, his privileged son converted to Christianity. So I found also documents about his story through the petitions that his son in 1713 tried to make to the community and to get back some patrimonies of the father. We are talking about an important merchant, Abraham Rovigo, an important merchant and philanthropist. So his house was really packed with scholars, emissary, Magidim, Sabbatian followers who were proclaiming themselves as messianic figures. And what about women here? What they are doing in this confined space? So basically, what we see in the house, also during the 18th century, when Rovigo was already in Jerusalem, then he died in 1713, I don't remember exactly when. 1713, yes. What happens is that in 1735, the women of his family, Miriam Rovigo and Grazia Rovigo in particular, established a confraternity. And this is the first confraternity, a philanthropic confraternity with the idea of taking care of the mitzvot and taking care of all the women in the ghetto, rich and poor. So this confraternity was basically gathering for 50 years until Miriam's death in the house of the Rovigos. So, and in the same room where the Kabbalistic confraternities were meeting in the night, these women were meeting in the day. And as we know, the Sabbatianism had a lot of attraction for women and in terms of ceremonies, in terms of participation. So that is also an element that I took into account. But these women were quite, basically they conformed to the expectations of the elite and the community. So they were quite conservative in their behavior. They were always emphasizing to be to following the community. And at the same time, though, they were organizing. So, for example, these women were excluded because of this. They were basically disappeared from the public sphere of the society at the moment, around the moment of the creation of the ghetto. There was a sort of keeping the balance in the community, and they were excluded from the business of their families, or often from the administration of their dowries. So what they were doing, excluded from their business in their own families, they were realizing actually through the confraternity. So they started making a business with even Gentile confraternities, with Jewish confraternities, organizing, being in a way contrasting the campaigns of the neophyte house to while giving charity to the poor, and also including more and more rituals. For example, a limud for a female member of the society that died. So, or ceremonies of donations of dowries or wood for the fireplace to the all poor in the society, in the ghetto of Modena. And gradually, what they did, they even established a female synagogue an exclusive female synagogue in the ghetto. So what you see here in a way is we are in the house, we are confined in the house, but then this house becomes also a way to articulate new way of rituals and new way of participations, recreating a new religious sphere or a professional sphere. For example, these women were also hiring nurses, Jewish nurses. They were also expert in gynecology, and they didn't need doctors. They were doing all the things by them, all the care of the poor by themselves. And gradually, there is a sort of exclusion from the synagogue, going to the house, and then going back back through the confraternity to the synagogue with the creation of this female synagogue, of which we have evidence about around the 1790s.
So this confraternity, chevra, is soid cholim, right? Did you kind of discover this and talk about the Pinchas and the sources that you used, that you found of this?
Yeah, the Sohed Cholim is so far the first, basically to benefit the sick, is so far the first confraternity we have in Europe with, and in general, with a complete Pinchas that was initiated in 1735 and was kept through 1943. So basically the confraternity's activities were shut down when the Nazis invaded Italy during the Second World War, and is preserved in the archives of the Comunità Ebraica of Modena, the Jewish community of Modena, and never studied still when I found it. No, actually, there was a mention by a local historian about that, and is a volume that was basically was updated by the same man for 50 years. His name was Leone Moisè Usiglio. He was a silversmith who was serving as a scribe in the community. And what we see here is this document in which, in a way, women are auditors, because Usiglio was recording their voices, and at the same time, then a meeting after a meeting, the minutes were read aloud and considered and approved. And the women are auditors and authors as well, because their opinions were always reported. What is also interesting here is that you can also see a sort of this time in starting 1730s in terms of the Jewish law and the halakha that in Modena was going on, that was very different compared to other communities. You can think about Altona, for example, or Hamburg, how rabbis and Jewish leaders were merchants, were in dialogue with the Jewish law in order also to change the position of women and keeping, particularly servant women who were found pregnant of illegitimate children and usually impregnated by their Jewish householder or Jewish co-workers. So what the rabbis in Modena and the Jewish lay leaders are doing, and in 1788 we have even a Halakha by that change the Jewish law, reworking within the frameworks of the halakha. So what happens is that if a girl under 25 is found pregnant, the householder is in any case responsible. So, or the father is found, and the father, of course, there were other cases, but they're talking about Jewish women, in this case, impregnated by Jewish men. So what happens is that the father is obliged to marry the girl and not to divorce her. Often there were cases of seduction. If the father is already married, he should adopt the child and take care of the child and adopt the child as his own child. If the father is not found, the householder under the roof, the Jewish girls were working, they must adopt the children, pay for the dowry for the girls, and in this way give, let's say, a possibility of these women and their illegitimate children to be integrated and reintegrated into the Jewish society rather than abandoned, as in other Jewish or Gentile contemporary contexts were happening. And here you see also the Soed Cholim sometimes providing dowries for these girls.
So, I mean, obviously we've talked about, bounced around a couple different parts of the chapters. We didn't really talk about this. Chapter 4, the invisible wealth of silver, the journey of the Formigines from the ghetto to the ducal court. There's so much in the book that we're not going to get to. You also have chapter 6, a Jewish urban geography of the ghetto and beyond. But just something that you end the book on is interesting. You talk about Moise Formigini before Napoleon, as you term it, and you 2 steps towards emancipation and 1 step back. That's the chapter 7. It's short. It's the end of the book. So talk a little bit about him.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. I really like Moise Formigini. He's one of my preferred figures in the book, and it is a great story. He was a member of these communities that I mentioned at the beginning, a member of these families. This family, the Formigini, they arrived from Ferrara in 1598. They were really small operators, and then in a couple of generations, they became one of the most important, and then the leading family in the ghetto of Modena. What happened is that Moise Formigini was active. First of all, he was named by the Duke as is the ducal silversmith and jeweler. And another important figure from a nearby city, always in the Este Duchy, Moise Beniamino Foa, was named as the ducal bookseller. These two were extremely active in fostering and importing, particularly Beniamino Foa, but also Formigini, in being involved with French culture and the idea of the French Revolution. What happened when in 1796 Napoleon invades Modena and other parts of northern Italy? Moise Formigini becomes immediately his referee. And he, for example, he immediately gives a speech in September 1796, a speech in front of Napoleon, where he advocates for Jews becoming active citizens. And here you see how Formigini and the other Jewish merchants, first of all, they become visible. So here is, they go in front of the new order, the representative of a new order, Napoleon, and they ask not to be admitted to merchant, but to be citizens. And the active citizenship is exactly a concept that comes from French secular enlightenment culture of the encyclopedia. So what he does, basically, he builds a speech that is packed with reference of the importance of Jews as a community of merchants. He imagined the community of merchants of Jews in Europe and elsewhere. He summarized a lot of arguments that were from Isaac Pinto, from Simone Luzzatto, other apologetic works. But what is interesting is that he summarized all the previous sources with a goal in mind: the admission of Jews into citizenship. So while he was summarizing and basically asking for the admission of Jews into the society, he was really doing so. So it was not just, he was not a cultured man. He was different from, for example, the rabbi of the city, Ishmael Cohen at the time, but he was doing what he was writing about. He was emancipating himself. He was advocating for him was crucial, looking at the Jewish law, looking at the Jewish Enlightenment inspired by the French culture, and to advocate for a broad education for Jewish children. And here what we see is a sort of a back and forth. So there is this optimism, and then at a certain point the ghetto is open. So the ghetto is open and Jews become visible in the city in 1797. So the gates are open, and that is the first time where Jews are attacked by the local population. So the fact they become visible during, for example, Holy Friday, instead of being in the ghetto, makes their presence problematic, while for the centuries before, there were no attacks against them. But what Moise Formigini did was the first Jew elected in an Italian parliament, and he then became, his second goal, and that is what an article I'm writing on, he was in correspondence with all the leaders of the Jewish intelligentsia in France and Germany, and he basically gathered around him Italian Jews in order to be a unified body in front of the authorities, considering various cities.
You mentioned there, actually it was good, you mentioned the Rishmal Kayan of Modena, the author of Zera Emes, which has just also been republished by Avad Shalom in 3 volumes, his Shalos V'Tshuvos. We didn't mention him. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about him. He was part of, at the end of his life, Napoleon's Sanhedrin. He answered those. He already answered questions that Napoleon gave. He actually didn't travel there. He was very old at the end of his life. He took over for his brother, actually, as the rabbi of Modena. I don't know if there's something that you want to talk about, mention him.
I think that Ishmael Cohen basically encapsulates what is the story about Italian Jews in general. He was among the rabbis at the end of the 18th century, surely the most cultured and intellectual, fluent in classic Latin, classic Greek, classic Hebrew, and then the priorities were quite clear. And when, for example, there are pressures and Vassili's request for in different Jewish communities that arrives also in Italy to give more emphasis and more role to the secular culture rather than the Jewish culture, Ishmael Cohen, the most cultured Italian rabbi, is the only one who says no. And that is a point that has been very well illustrated by a historian some years ago, Lois Dubin, who make clear that, here are Italian Jews. Italian Jews select what is interesting for them from the German Ashkalah, but the priority is that Judaism is more important than secular culture for them is there, because in any case they don't need to show that they are Italian. They are already Italian, and they don't need to show or to learn Italian because they know Italian, they know Italian literature. They are Italian in culture as well as Jewish in Hebrew culture.
Yeah, that's a tshuva, I think, in volume 2, related to Wesley's Divrei Shalom V'Emes. It's a famous tshuva. So this has been redone now by Avad Shalom. If anyone's interested in his psakim, I think the Chida quotes him a lot. So I forgot, we talked about famous rabbinic figures. I forgot to mention him. He's, he also has, there's some drushes printed of his, Haggadah, that he has a commentary on Haggadah. So there's some interesting things printed from him. So like I said, we a lot of things you mentioned are in the book, and there's a lot more. There's a lot that we did not get to. There's a lot of sources that you use and other information, other stories, other families here in the book that we didn't get to. So first of all, are there any general points that you want to make regarding any parts of the book that we did not get to that perhaps you want to just point out?
No, actually, I think that even if I didn't mention all the families, etc., I think I mentioned the most interesting aspect. I would say that as a conclusion, that the story of Jews in Modena is particular in terms of we see a particular process of cultural integration and also legal emancipation that didn't happen suddenly. It was a slow process during the 17th and the 18th century. Jewish merchants stood up in their community, but at the same time, they were not overwhelmed by changes and, for example, the Enlightenment. There were no conversion that happened elsewhere, but both men and women were capable of leading the society and the culture of the society, proposing this kind of new kind of cultural path and integration through Renaissance culture, female agency, and practice of enlightenment that is unique in the European context and the American context as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I always find Italian Jewish history fascinating. This is one of the things, like you said, this is Modena is like a microcosm of that. So what you mentioned earlier, you're working now on Venice. I mean, what are you currently working on?
So I'm working actually regarding the spin-off of the book or part left out. I'm working on an article on Moisè Formigine and his first 10 years in the 19th century, where actually he was unifying Italian Jewry and participating in the debates about Jewish emancipation in Europe, because I found a lot of writings and letters and correspondence and nobody ever published. I'm also working on these Jewish servants and their vicissitudes. So in the book, I look at how the elite was looking at them and trying to solve the problem. The main issue was not destroying the balance of the community. And I'm interested now in how they expressed themselves during the trials, when the seducers were accused, history of emotion. And by my new book project is about the Jewish community in Venice in 16th and 17th century. I look at the Jewish home there as a network of different slaves that arrive in the Jewish house, Jews, Muslim, and Black African women who then are manumitted by Jews and kept living in the Jewish house, global culture, and the global material culture. So how Jews from the Levant, from Venice, from Livorno, who arrived, or from Spain, arrived in Venice, and they were basically protagonists of this culture of things that permeated Venice. And I'm looking at also networks of women who were working in Venice, and they were creating new forms of literacy through textiles rather than books.
Okay, very interesting. So I'll put a link in the show's notes to Invisible Enlighteners. People can find the book. And thank you very much for joining me to talk about it.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I'm very grateful. Thank you.